What I felt was the most horrifying and terrifying thing I could have ever felt. And while we were talking, she said, "Mom, I have to tell you something. Do you remember when you called me on the phone?" "Yes, well, I didn't talk to you, nor did I talk to anyone."
Without knowing what it was or what was happening, the only thing I knew inside me was that it was alive.
My name is Nanina, and I want to share my experience with death. Surely many people still have doubts about whether there is something beyond. What happens when we die, for example? And this story might give you some answers, but it's up to you to take it in and understand it however you can and however you think is best. I'm from Buenos Aires, and I don't know if what happened to me is something hereditary or just a simple coincidence. I say this because my grandmother had the ability to connect with the dead, and I think I do too. There were countless times when I found myself in a rather uncomfortable place trying to understand what was happening. Maybe all of this sounds a bit confusing, so I'm going to get straight to the point so you can hear what happened to me that time, which was something incredible. I could tell you that the beginning of this story was a few years ago, when my mom, already older and with advanced osteoporosis, fractured her spine in 2 places when she tried to lift a very, very heavy object. That moment was the beginning of a greater decline in her, because even though she recovered quite a bit, considering her age, of course she still walked as much as she could. But as time went by, the pain, which was already chronic, started to become so strong that it limited her a lot. Getting out of bed, therefore, she tried to stay lying down most of the time. Something that, being an extremely active woman throughout her whole life, she obviously didn't like. My husband is a sailor, so we spent most of our time in Bahia Blanca while my sister and mom lived in Belgrano, in the capital. I visited whenever I could, and after this happened, I came several times a month, simply to see my mom and also to help my sister, of course, in any way I could. And on one of these many trips, I had a conversation with my mom, which is the key to this experience. We talked about death without so much fear and completely freely, because we knew very well that everyone's time comes to cross over to the other side, or as I usually say, when it's our time to move, because this continues in another way. In those moments we made a promise to each other that basically meant whoever died first would try to come back, to communicate and give at least a sign, even if it's minimal, to the one who stayed in this plane, to reassure them that everything was fine and life continued on the other side.
I asked her, "Will you promise to communicate with me?" And she looked at me very sweetly and said, "I promise you." That was it. We talked about many other things. Well, I went back to Bahia Blanca, and on another trip I took right after I had arrived, my older sister called me and said to come because Mom had a very high blood pressure spike. When I arrived, they were already taking her to the hospital on a stretcher. I went up to her and spoke to her. She stared at me, and the doctor said, "Ma'am, don't talk to her because she doesn't recognize you."
My mom was hospitalized. It's serious. And the doctors asked us to try to avoid it as much as possible. To talk, get emotional or angry, but mainly stay calm. During one of the visits, we were outside talking with a doctor who was treating her, and suddenly we heard a noise. And we also saw nurses and doctors moving around. Even my mom's doctor went into the intensive care unit because there was obviously an emergency. And that's what happened, because a few minutes later they informed us that unfortunately our mom had gone into cardiorespiratory arrest and they couldn't prevent her death.
So, well, we went in and each of us stood on one side of the stretcher. And don't ask me why. Instinctively, I lifted my head to look at the ceiling, at the corner of the room's ceiling, and I smiled. Afterwards, well, I kept looking at her and, well, everything that was supposed to happen happened in between. And I go back to Bahia Blanca. So I was walking down a street at the Puerto Belgrano naval base, actually in Puerto Belgrano, not Bahia Blanca, and felt really strange. I felt like I got tired when I walked, that I walked very slowly. I felt something strange inside, something that threw me off within myself. And sometimes I had to sit down at the base of a column just to catch my breath and be able to keep walking, even though I had barely walked at all. And everything caught my attention, but I was far from thinking that something could happen to me or that anything strange was going on.
A few weeks later, I returned to Buenos Aires for paperwork to see family, and something terrible happened at my mom's house. That night I was about to take a shower. It was around 7 in the evening or so, and when I walked past the vanity mirror heading to the shower, I saw that the reflection wasn't mine. Just as I'm telling you, the image reflected back at me was the exact likeness of my mom. Not like in her last days, but in her best moments, with brown hair, with her perm, dressed just the way she liked. It was just a split second when I walked past the mirror, but I insist I saw her so clearly, so vividly that I was frozen, wondering if this was real or not. So I retraced my steps, stood in front of the mirror, and this time the reflection was none other than my own. And even though it could have all been a simple misunderstanding, let's suppose, I kept thinking about it a lot. What had happened was something that really left me surprised, because I couldn't do anything else but think, because it didn't happen again during the days I was in that house.
Well, a few days go by, I returned to the Puerto Belgrano naval base. I'm in one of the hotel rooms and I wasn't feeling very well. I stay in bed and ask the maids for a menu. They bring me a turbofan and set it on the dresser in the room, something I normally wouldn't do. I felt odd doing it, but I felt I had to stay in bed, unable to move. So I call my daughter on the phone. She lives in the Villa Ballester neighborhood, also here in the North Zone. And I start talking. What I do notice while I'm talking to her is that she asks me how I am. I say, oh, I'm in bed with awful back pain and can't move. And my mom had a habit of turning to her right, where the nightstand was, opening the drawer and taking out a pen or her glasses, any medicine. And I instinctively do exactly the same thing while I'm talking. But I don't take anything out. I just rummage through the drawer, and at that moment I'm thinking, what am I doing? Meanwhile, I continue talking with my daughter. Well, things like I tell her, well, I tell you I'm really tired, I'm going to sleep, and so on. A few days go by, I go back to Buenos Aires because I was coming and going, and I go to visit my daughter at her house and me. And while we were talking, she says to me, Mom, I have to tell you something. Do you remember when you called me on the phone? Yes. Well, I didn't talk to you, she says to me. I talked to my grandma. They used to call my mom Uma, so she told me I talked to Uma.
At first, when I heard this, I stayed silent, like I was trying to understand what she was trying to tell me. But then I realized that that night I had felt very strange. I felt different, like I wasn't myself. My daughter told me that even after we ended our conversation, she talked to her husband and excitedly told him what had just happened. She not only felt she spoke to Uma, but heard her exact voice, including her tone and pronunciation. In fact, the conversation was even about things they normally talked about. Something so strange, curious, and surprising that I assure you words aren't enough to describe it. That time I decided to tell her what had happened to me in the mirror, how I felt. And it was so strange that I hadn't told anyone. Until that moment. She was the first one. But a few days later, something else happened. In the middle of the night, my husband and I were sleeping in Puerto Belgrano in one of the bedrooms, and suddenly I woke up. Why? I have no idea, but I felt the need to curl up, getting into a semi-fetal position, just so you understand. My husband never woke up, and it was at that very moment that I heard a voice, and the phrase was the following.
Go, get out, leave her, you're dead.
I looked around everywhere trying to process what had happened, what that voice was. And again, the same thing repeats, go, get out, leave her, you're dead.
At that moment, what I felt was the most horrifying and terrifying thing I could have ever felt. And out of the 7 births I had, it was never with so much pain. I felt as if 2 hands were squeezing both sides of my stomach with a lot of force. I even thought or felt that the walls were closing in. It felt like my organs were going to come out, and I thought, what are they doing to me? Are they taking out my organs? And I started to feel that pain or that sensation rising, and it kept getting stronger. Then it moved to my chest and became unbearable. My eyes were already wide open because I was really panicking. I thought I was dying. And in that second, in that thought where everything happens so fast, it feels like it's eternal. I noticed that I open my mouth in an impressive way, really wide, and suddenly I hear something like ha ha ha. And I see in the little light, there was from a nightstand lamp, which was kind of dim, something like it's not exactly a cloud, but more like a wide, long mist that comes out of my mouth and rises, forming a sort of the movement like that of a snake. Sorry for the comparison, but that's what I see. And it keeps rising, making those curves, and then it disappears.
At that very moment, absolutely all the discomfort I had, every bad feeling, calmed down, and I felt perfectly fine. Beyond that, of course, it was impossible to keep sleeping. Maybe not out of fear, but more because I kept thinking about everything that had happened and everything that had been happening lately, asking myself over and over if I was really connected or not. And
it took me a long time to talk about this. And I don't remember if I've told my children. I don't think so. I think the only one who knows is my husband. And since then, there hasn't been any other kind of manifestation. But over time, I started to think and I said, wow, we had made a pact. And my mom promised me that later somehow she would communicate with me. Well, I think that was the way she could, the way she chose, the way she found
To communicate with me.
my name is Christina, and I want to share with you my experience, one that was without a doubt the most intense thing that ever happened to me in my whole life.
One of the last ones, and maybe the one that left me the most confused, was me. 2 years ago, I lost my 20-year-old daughter. She passed away suddenly in her sleep. A week after that experience, I was in my room, lying down, sitting on the bed. I wasn't completely lying down. She suddenly opened her eyes. And in front of me, I have a little fuchsia-colored ball, about 10 centimeters from my eyes. And I just stared at it immediately without knowing what it was or what was happening. The only thing I knew inside me was that it was alive and that it was looking at me. I mean, that was the feeling I had, but it was like a conviction that what I was looking at was alive. I had my cell phone to the right of the bed. I turned slowly because it's like the experience was in slow motion, I remember. So I start to turn slowly to record what I had on my face. When I turn again, I see that light go to a corner of the room where there were 10 more lights of the same color, fuchsia. It seemed transparent, yet the fuchsia light spun rapidly inside. Then they passed through the ceiling. And
I discussed my daughter's grief because it happened while I was grieving too. Logically, I was doing very badly, but I was fighting to move forward for my family. In fact, 5 months after she passed away, my son turned 10 years old. And you know what? My daughter's dream had been that to celebrate as a gift, the 4 of us would take a trip together to Iguazu Falls. So we wanted to fulfill that wish she had, her last one, without knowing it, and we organized it. The day we arrived in Iguazu, it was very hot, over 30 degrees. And when we settled into the apartment, we decided to sleep, a little nap with the air conditioning, and then go out for a walk. Later, when the sun is a little lower. That same afternoon, something unique happened again, and it showed me that those who leave, those who die, simply leave the body behind. But they are closer than we think. No, there's something more, soul, energy, or whatever you call it. I hope they accompany us from somewhere else, surely waiting for us to meet again.
we shut the curtains, turned on the air conditioner, and lay down for a bit. Dad was in a room, we were in the same room, but he was in a single bed, and I was in the double bed with my little boy. We fell asleep. And at one point, I opened my eyes and see on the ceiling the same lights I saw in my room. 15 days after that happened, but this time there were hundreds of white lights, all about the same size, some a little bigger, some a little smaller, but they were like that transparent little balls. There were lights that moved, and there were hundreds of them on the ceiling. I just remember opening my eyes, looking at them and watching them, because I was never scared. I never felt anything, just looking at them. Control virtually. the game because I had too much peace. I can't explain it. I don't even know what it was. That's my experience.